Ethics in engineering is a topic that we need to look at. This is something that ABET requires as part of our education here, and it's something that's going to be important as you get into your career. And some things that we're going to have to understand is that for an ethical situation that we have a responsibility to society, to the people that are going to be interacting with our designs, our products, maybe the people that can be affected by our products. We also have a responsibility to our employer to make sure that we're good employees, but also we as employees, as engineers, will have rights that we need to also consider. So one of the things I want to talk about is that there could be conflicts of interest that can occur, and we need to know how we can best deal with those. So as we define ethics, we can look at that as being kind of a study of a moral philosophy and looking at how individuals relate with the society and with others around them. And so maybe it's defining what's the difference between good and evil, or right and wrong, some of the terminology you might hear about when you study ethics. How would you define virtuous living, or taking justice, and what in actions that require a response. So it's about what do I do? It's a study of how you should act. So when we are looking in situations most likely that we'll encounter as an engineer, is that we'll probably have to look at maybe situations where we'll have a conflict of interest. And a definition of that is where you have a situation where you have to kind of exercise good judgment because we may make a decision that might benefit maybe ourselves or somebody else because of our special knowledge that we might have. So there could be a potential for a bad ethical decision when maybe we're working with a client, and maybe it's somebody that maybe you're interested in working for, and maybe you're going to try to maybe take some of your company's secrets and maybe try to go over to that other client in order to maybe make more money for them and for yourself. So that would be maybe a conflict of interest. And so in situations where you have to make a decision, where a good judgment is necessary in order to make sure that there's no ethical violations there, then you kind of have a potential there for a conflict of interest. And sometimes even an appearance of a conflict of interest can be a problem. Even if nothing was done, sometimes there could be legal ramifications for that. There's been examples in the past of people whose companies, maybe they knew there was some bad news coming out, and so they sold a bunch of their company's stock before that happened so that they wouldn't lose a lot of money. That's kind of some insider trading, or maybe some new products coming out, and so you buy a bunch of stock beforehand, just because you know your company's going to be worth more money after that information comes out. And that's a conflict of interest sometimes that will be considered as. So let's look at a responsibility that you may have for society. As in general, looking at that when you're designing something, you want to make sure that it's going to be safe to use, that it's not going to be harming people, the people that are using it or other people that are around there. Right? If you design a bridge, you don't want it to fall down. Right? If you're designing a product, you don't want it to electrocute people, or you don't want it to crash, or things like that. So we want to be able to make sure that we understand that the engineering that we're doing calculations that are based on experimental testing, that we're going to be proving that our product is safe through experimentation, and there's always some unknowns in that case. So we need to make sure that we have at least some factor of safety in there in order to make sure that it is safe, or that we have lots of inspections to make sure that unexpected things aren't going to happen. So we want to make sure that whoever is signing off on a design, that they are held accountable for what they're signing off on, that they're making sure that the proper engineering practices are taken. That's something maybe a professional engineer with a license that's been licensed to do that will maybe do that at a company. Some companies will have lots of professional engineers. Some of them might only have a few that oversee the other engineers there. So we want to make sure that as an engineer, when you're working, that you have a technical competence, that you're skilled in the actions that you're going to be doing as an engineer. So the different calculations you'll make, we want to make sure that you get lots of practice and understanding in order to do those correctly, that you're not that you're doing things in a professional manner. So that's what we're trying to train you in your time in college, in order to try to make sure that you have at least some technical competence when you go out into the work field. And that's something you'll get more of too. So a code of ethics is something that's important for engineers, and this is from the National Society of Professional Engineers. This is a kind of a general one, and each society that is out there, from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers to IEEE, the Electronics and Electrical Engineers, a lot of those organizations have their own special code of ethics. So some of the fundamental canons that come from the Code of Ethics from NSPE is that as you're working as an engineer, right, you want to make sure that the safety and health and welfare of the public is your primary concern, over top of any concerns that your employer might try to put in front of you. That when you're acting as an engineer, that you're only doing so in areas that you've been trained, that you're competent in. If you're making a public statement, which you may or may not have to do as an engineer, but that you're not being deceptive, that you're being truthful in making that. So maybe if you were talking about the problem with the braking in Toyota's electronic braking systems, that maybe you should be truthful about that and not lie about that to try to save your company from lawsuits and things like that, because things will come out in the end. That when you're acting for your employer, right, that you're doing so as a faithful agent of your employer, that you're trying to avoid being deceptive in how you act, not trying to cover up mistakes that were made, and being honest about them, and that when you're acting in honorary ways and responsibly and ethically, so as an engineer. So that's a real brief rundown of the Code of Ethics that engineers can follow. So as you're working as an engineer, there's probably a lot of things that you're supposed to follow, such as safety codes, and you could follow professional codes to make sure things are being done properly. Sometimes these can be considered to cost money and time for your company. They're usually there for some type of safety reason or to make sure things are done properly. So if you don't follow them correctly, then maybe if some failure occurs, right, it's kind of going to be a problem if they found out you weren't following the proper codes. So we got to make sure that when you're making sure that your company is following codes properly, that someone that's understanding the code is able to judge that, and people that are applying the codes understand what the codes are for. Maybe not just the letter of the law, but what is the general intent of the code or the standard, to make sure that you're following it as close as you can. Sometimes there's some question on how things may be applied, so we want to make sure that you're following the intent of those codes and standards. And we want to make sure that someone that is responsible to make sure that those codes are being met for your company also. So there could be some legal codes and standards that you're required to follow. There could be like OSHA things in order to keep your employees safe, or maybe you're following codes that keep your users of your product safe. So we want to make sure that they're written in a proper manner. A lot of times maybe some of these laws are made in response to something that happened, and they might be pretty specific. Sometimes you can be involved in maybe writing some of those things as being called in to represent the field in order to kind of write those codes properly. And we want to make sure that we're not just doing the minimum amount in order to make compliance, because then sometimes there could be some safety issues if things aren't done exactly right. So, and there are other codes and standards that are voluntary for companies to follow, but maybe they would be safer if they did follow them, or you're more sure that the design will be working correctly, or that your customers will be safer. Some of them, like Underwriters Laboratory, the UL symbol you might see on some of your electronic products, those are used in most electronic products that you see. Mainly it's just to make sure that the electronics and the electricity and the things like that inside are safe, that they're not going to be harmful to the user. There's different codes like the ASTM codes for testing materials. That's the standards for testing of materials, to make sure that materials are tested properly, so that you know that they're have the right strength to them. ISO 9001 is another example of a voluntary code that's looked at by suppliers, is to make sure that everything that you're measuring is done with a measurement instrument that's been calibrated and documented, and it's recalibrated and checked regularly. And a lot of companies might require that your supplier is ISO 9000 compliant, otherwise they won't work with you. So sometimes these codes and standards might be necessary in order to get more customers. And let's move on to how your responsibility to your employer also, and not just to society. So, and one of the main things as probably an engineer will be the issue with confidentiality, that maybe you have trade secrets or important information that you have access to that you want to make sure isn't divulged to your competitors. There could be proprietary information. You may have to sign off on a confidentiality agreement to make sure that you're not revealing those that information, that data, or those trade secrets to your competitors. That's something that happens even with our interactions here. A lot of our senior design teams work with companies that require them to sign off on a confidentiality agreement to make sure that they don't divulge certain information to the public, that maybe there could be competitors that might be working here with other students and want to make sure that they're not sharing that information, or maybe they might, they might go work for a competitor in the future, that they can't use some of that information and reveal that to their competitors. So, but there's always this trade-off between, employer can't require their employee to stay working them forever, that the employee has a right to find another job somewhere. Lots of times it might be with a competitor, and people will go back and forth between competing companies just because they have those skills. So there's this trade-off between, how do you deal with confidentiality, and how do you keep those secrets as an employee, keep those secrets confidential that you may know, that you can't use if you change jobs. So, for example, this is an example of some guy named Ken here we're going to use. It works for a company that's a chemical company, and they've kind of taken this piece of equipment that they've used for plastic processing. They've kind of specialized it to do something that they really need to have done. They don't patent it, but because then the patent makes sure that makes the information public. They want to keep that secret, so they make sure none of their competitors will receive that information. So then Ken decides to leave the company, but then maybe he goes and works for a candy processing company, and he knows that maybe this information that he knows about this machine that he modified would work well to modify their process to making candy and fudge and things like that. But can he use that information, since he maybe signed a confidentiality agreement not to divulge that information? And that gets a little questionable there in that case study, just because he's working for a company that he signed an agreement for, but this company he's going to is not necessarily a competitor, so he might be able to modify the equipment some and kind of do a similar process, but it probably would need a lot of modification in order to make it work for this food processing product. So it might be okay to use some of that information as long as they're not divulging it to the competitors of his original company. So it gets a little gray there. There could be a conflict of interest there that you could be going against. So these are some of the issues that we can look at, and we want to make sure that as engineers that we're not having conflicts of interest as we work as an engineer. We want to make sure that we're being truthful in what we do, and that we're being ethical in how we practice our engineering.